The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. The air was warm but not oppressive, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the trees that lined the neighborhood. The sounds of children playing in the distance, the occasional car passing by, and the chirping of birds created a peaceful backdrop. It was the kind of afternoon that felt like time had slowed, each moment stretching out longer than the last. In the front yard of a modest house, David Miller sat on the porch, sipping his iced tea, his eyes never straying far from his young son, Ethan. Ethan, a curious and energetic 7-year-old, was lost in his own world of imagination. His small hands gripped a plastic sword, well worn from countless adventures, and he charged around the yard, pretending to battle invisible foes. His laughter, high-pitched and carefree, rang through the air as he swung the sword at nothing and everything. David smiled to himself, a quiet pride swelling in his chest as he watched his son. Being a single father had its challenges, but moments like this made it all worthwhile. He had raised Ethan on his own for the past few years, and while the responsibility was overwhelming at times, seeing his son so full of life was a reminder of what really mattered. The neighborhood, nestled on a quiet cul-de-sac, had always felt like a safe haven. The houses were modest but well kept, each with neatly trimmed lawns and colorful flower beds. Children played together on the sidewalks, and the neighbors waved as they passed. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were often left unlocked and people trusted each other without hesitation. But today, something felt different. Across the street, in a house with perfectly manicured hedges and a freshly painted porch, Karen Green stood in her window, her eyes fixed on David and Ethan. Karen was new to the neighborhood, having recently moved in after a series of personal issues had driven her from her previous home. From the moment she arrived, she had made it clear that she was watchful, suspicious even. David had exchanged pleasantries with her when she first moved in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was always looking for something to criticize, something to judge. And now, as she observed from her window, David couldn't help but notice the way she stared at Ethan, her eyes narrowing as he swung his toy sword. It wasn't the first time he had sensed her disapproval, but today it felt different, more intense. Maybe it was the way she stood there, rigid and unmoving, as if waiting for something to happen. Or maybe it was the way she'd look at him and Ethan from her window, always watching, always calculating. David's instincts kicked in, but he pushed the uneasy feeling aside. It was a quiet afternoon. Ethan was playing, and he had every right to enjoy the simple joys of childhood. Still, David couldn't help but wonder just what Karen saw when she looked at his son. As the wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees and shifting the atmosphere, David took another sip of his drink, determined to enjoy the peace while it lasted. But a nagging feeling, like an itch he couldn't scratch, stayed with him as he watched Karen's eyes remain fixed on Ethan. In the back of his mind, David wondered if today would be the day that something changed. David had just settled into his chair, taking in the cool breeze as Ethan continued to play in the front yard, oblivious to the world around him. The sound of the plastic sword slicing through the air filled the otherwise silent street. Ethan's laughter rang out as he took another imaginary swing, his small face lit up with joy. To David, it was a perfect moment, a reminder of the innocence of childhood. However, as the minutes passed, David's sense of ease slowly began to fade. He noticed Karen Green stepping out of her front door, her gaze immediately fixed on Ethan. At first, it seemed like a casual observation, but then her eyes narrowed as she watched him swing the toy sword. David could feel the weight of her stare, sharp and intense, as if she was sizing up his son. David raised a hand in greeting, a warm smile on his face, assuming that Karen had simply come outside to enjoy the day. He had spoken to her a few times since she moved in, though their conversations had always been brief. But there was something about her that left him feeling uneasy, like she was always on the lookout for something to criticize. "Good afternoon, Karen," David called out cheerfully, hoping to break the ice. "Beautiful day, huh?" Karen didn't respond to the greeting with the same warmth. Instead, she walked briskly across the yard, her steps purposeful. Her gaze didn't waver from Ethan, who continued to play, completely unaware of the attention he was receiving. As Karen reached the edge of David's driveway, she stopped, her eyes cold. "David," she said, her voice tense, "I need to talk to you about your son." David blinked, confused by her sudden seriousness. He stood up, trying to read her expression, but all he saw was a stern face, one that seemed to carry more concern than he expected. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he tried to keep the conversation light. "What's the matter?" he asked, still holding on to a friendly tone. "Is everything okay?" Karen didn't respond to the question directly. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was around, and then back to Ethan, her voice lowering as she spoke again. "Your son," she began slowly, "he's holding something that could be seen as a weapon. You know, with everything going on these days, neighborhood security, the rise in crime, things like that, it could cause a lot of alarm." David furrowed his brow, his confusion deepening. "It's just a toy sword," he said, gesturing toward Ethan, who was now making sword-fighting noises as he charged across the yard. "He's just playing, Karen. Nothing more to it." But Karen wasn't convinced. She shook her head, her eyes flashing with a mixture of concern and something else, something David couldn't quite place. "I'm just saying, David. In this neighborhood, with all the heightened security, you can't be too careful. Someone might see that and get the wrong idea." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're seriously worried about a toy sword?" he asked, trying to keep the incredulity out of his voice. "It's not just about the sword," Karen replied sharply. "It's about perception. What if someone who doesn't know any better sees him? What if they call the police? What happens then?" David was taken aback. He had never once considered that a child's toy, something so harmless, could be viewed in such a way. He looked over at Ethan, who was still laughing, happily lost in his imaginary world. He was completely unaware of the tension building between the adults. "It's just a game, Karen," David said, his voice more firm now, a little defensive. "He's a kid. He's not a threat to anyone." Karen's eyes softened just a fraction, but the doubt in her expression remained. "I get that, David. But you have to think about the bigger picture. If something happens, if someone feels threatened, I'm not going to let that happen," David interrupted, his tone becoming more resolute. "It's a toy, Karen. He's just playing." Karen didn't respond immediately. She stood there, staring at Ethan, then at David, as if she were weighing her next words carefully. Finally, she shook her head, almost reluctantly. "I'm just saying, be careful. This neighborhood's a little too quick to jump to conclusions sometimes. You don't want to cause unnecessary trouble." David nodded, though he couldn't suppress the rising frustration in his chest. He understood her concerns, but this? This was something else entirely. Karen had taken a simple moment of play and turned it into something dark and dangerous. He wasn't going to let her project her fears onto his son. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, his voice level but tinged with the hint of finality. "But Ethan's going to keep playing, and I'm going to make sure no one causes trouble over it." Karen seemed to realize the conversation had reached its limit. She gave a curt nod, her gaze flicking one last time to Ethan, before she turned and walked back toward her house. David exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. He watched as Karen disappeared inside, still uncertain of where this tension between them would lead. Ethan, oblivious to the conversation that had just unfolded, continued his play, the toy sword now held high above his head as he declared himself the victor of his imaginary battle. David couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time he would have to deal with Karen's overbearing nature. But for now, he just wanted to watch his son play. The following afternoon, the air around David's house seemed to thicken with the weight of an unspoken tension. It was just another sunny day, the kind of day where kids were supposed to be outside playing, free of worry. Yet, despite the warmth of the sun, David couldn't shake the cold feeling that had settled in his chest since his conversation with Karen. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she'd looked at Ethan, the fear and suspicion clouding her judgment. David was outside again, this time cleaning out the garage, when he noticed Karen standing at her window, staring in their direction. Her eyes, sharp and focused, were fixed on Ethan, who was now in the backyard, pretending to battle dragons with his toy sword. Ethan's laughter, light and carefree, carried over the fence, but David could sense that Karen wasn't listening to that sound. Instead, she was focused on the sword, the same toy that she had made an issue of the day before. David sighed, setting down his cleaning supplies. He knew it was only a matter of time before Karen came over again, this time perhaps with more fire in her eyes. And he was right. Barely 10 minutes later, Karen was on his front steps again, her face a mask of determination. David had braced himself for this moment, but even still, he couldn't hide the frustration creeping up his neck. "David," Karen said, her voice more insistent now. "We need to talk." David wiped his hands on a rag and straightened up, trying to keep his tone calm. "About what, Karen?" Karen's eyes flicked over to Ethan, who was now kneeling in the grass, his sword raised high. "That," she said, her voice almost trembling with concern. "You can't keep letting him run around like that. Someone is going to see him with that toy and think he's armed. He's holding something that could be mistaken for a real weapon." David blinked, taken aback by the depth of her reaction. "It's just a toy sword, Karen. It's plastic. It's harmless. Ethan's just pretending to be a knight." But Karen didn't seem to hear him. Her gaze remained fixed on the toy, her face twisted with what almost looked like fear. "I don't care what it is. The point is, it's dangerous. No child should be carrying something that could be seen as a weapon. You don't know how people will react." David felt a jolt of frustration. "It's a game. He's playing. He's 7 years old, Karen. He's not out to hurt anyone." Karen shook her head, her lips pressed together tightly. "You don't understand. People around here are on edge. It's too risky, David. I've seen things happen. We can't just ignore it. I'm not saying he's a bad kid, but what if someone gets scared and calls the cops? What if things go south because you didn't take this seriously?" David felt the blood rush to his face, the sharpness of her words biting into him like a sudden chill. His patience was wearing thin, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "So, you think it's better to call the police on a child pretending to be a knight? Just because he's holding a toy sword?" Karen's posture stiffened, her eyes flashing with something darker now, something that almost felt like anger. "Yes, I think it's better to be safe than sorry. We're talking about a child carrying something that could look like a threat to others. If someone panics, it could be bad. I'm just looking out for the safety of the neighborhood. I'm doing what I have to do." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. He opened his mouth to respond, but Karen beat him to it. "I'm calling the police," she said, her voice firm and final. "It's for everyone's safety. I don't want to do this, but I don't see any other choice." David's heart dropped. He felt a surge of anger bubble up from his stomach, but he quickly suppressed it. He needed to stay calm. He needed to keep control of the situation. "Karen, you're overreacting. This isn't a threat. It's just a toy. Ethan's just a child. You can't just keep accusing him of things that aren't true. You're turning a harmless situation into something it's not." Karen crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "You think I'm overreacting? You think I'm being unreasonable? I'm doing what's best for everyone here, David. I'm protecting the community. People need to be aware of what's going on around them, and I won't stand by while you let your child carry something that could be seen as dangerous." David's frustration flared, and he felt his pulse quicken. "This is about control, Karen, not about safety. You're trying to impose your rules on my son, on our family, because of your own fears. You're acting like this is some kind of threat, when it's just a game. But Karen stood her ground, her face rigid with determination. I'm not afraid. I'm just being responsible. And if you can't see that, then maybe I'm the only one who's going to do the right thing here. David's chest tightened. The conversation was spiraling into territory he didn't want to explore, but he knew it was already too late. He wasn't going to let Karen dictate how he raised his son, but her accusations were beginning to chip away at the calm he had worked so hard to maintain. Fine, David said, his voice colder now. Call the police. But when this blows up in your face, don't say I didn't warn you. Karen didn't respond, her eyes still locked onto Ethan, who had stopped playing and was looking curiously at the scene unfolding. David turned to his son, his heart heavy with a mix of anger and disbelief. This wasn't how he wanted things to go. This wasn't how childhood should be. But as Karen's fingers reached for her phone, David realized this wasn't just a small misunderstanding anymore. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would test not only his patience but his ability to protect his family from a neighbor who seemed to see threats everywhere. The tension between them had only just begun. The tension in the air thickened as Karen's fingers hovered over her phone, her gaze fixed firmly on Ethan. David could feel his blood pressure rising, the frustration simmering just below the surface. He had hoped that reason and calm would be enough to end the confrontation, but it was clear Karen wasn't going to back down. Her eyes, once sharp with suspicion, now gleamed with a mix of righteousness and something darker, an unshakable conviction that she was doing the right thing, even if it was causing unnecessary chaos. David watched as she pressed the numbers on her phone, speaking in a hushed, yet deliberate tone. Yes, this is Karen Green from Maple Street. I need to report a potential weapon on my neighbor's property. There's a child out there, holding something that looks like a gun. He's in the yard right now, playing with it. I'm concerned that it could be dangerous. David's jaw tightened, and he took a deep breath. Karen, stop, he said, his voice low and firm. It's just a toy. I told you this already. But she didn't seem to hear him. Instead, she continued talking into the phone, her voice rising. Yes, I understand. It's a young boy, probably about 7 or 8 years old. I don't know if it's a toy or not, but it definitely looks like a weapon. He's running around, pointing it at people and pretending to fight. I'm concerned about the safety of the neighborhood. I believe it's best to check it out. David could feel the knot in his stomach tightening as Karen's words twisted the reality of the situation. She was painting Ethan as something he wasn't, a threat, a danger to the community, based on nothing more than a toy sword. Ethan, oblivious to the rising tension, had resumed his play, slashing the air with his sword and laughing joyfully. But to Karen, that innocent play was enough to justify calling the police. David felt the anger bubbling up inside him, but he bit his tongue. He couldn't let this get any worse, not with Ethan standing right there. He forced himself to stay calm, to not let Karen's wild exaggerations provoke him further. He walked toward her slowly, his voice steady but laced with frustration. Karen, I'm asking you one more time to drop this. He's a child. He's not doing anything wrong. But Karen didn't respond, her focus entirely on the phone call. It was as if she couldn't hear anything that didn't fit into her narrow view of the situation. Her mind was set, and she wasn't going to listen to reason. David watched as she finally hung up, looking at him with a smug expression. They're sending officers, she said, her tone dripping with false calmness. They're going to check it out. This is for everyone's safety. David clenched his fists at his sides, doing his best to control the simmering rage inside him. He knew the situation was about to escalate, and he didn't want to make things worse for Ethan. But this was crossing a line. Karen had just turned a harmless game into an emergency. She had called the police, not because there was a real threat, but because of her own fears and suspicions. Before David could respond, the sound of a siren in the distance cut through the air. He knew it was only a matter of time before the police arrived, and sure enough, within minutes, a patrol car pulled up in front of his house. Two officers stepped out, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter and more wiry. Both seemed alert but cautious, taking in the scene as they approached the porch. David walked up to meet them, his chest tight with frustration. "Officers, this is ridiculous," he said, trying to remain calm. "There's no need for you to be here. My son is playing with a toy sword. It's harmless." The taller officer, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense attitude, nodded but didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked over at Karen, who was standing on the sidewalk, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "what's the situation here?" Karen's face tightened with a hint of triumph. She stepped forward, eager to explain her version of events. "I saw the boy holding something that looked like a weapon," she said, her voice shaking slightly with what seemed like genuine concern. "I wasn't sure what it was, but it seemed like he was threatening people. I didn't know what else to do. I'm just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." David opened his mouth to protest, but the officer raised a hand to stop him. "We'll check it out, sir," he said, his tone measured but firm. David's stomach sank. He could feel the powerlessness creeping in, the helplessness of the situation making his limbs feel heavy. The officers were just doing their job, but it didn't seem right. This was all because of Karen's irrational fears. They were treating it like a real threat, and Ethan, who was still playing innocently in the yard, was caught in the middle of it. The shorter officer, who had remained quiet so far, glanced over at Ethan, who had paused his play to watch the officer's approach. The officer looked at the sword in Ethan's hand, then back at Karen and David. "Is this what you were concerned about?" he asked, his voice calm and neutral. David nodded, still trying to keep his composure. "Yes, it's just a toy. I've explained this to Karen already." The taller officer stepped forward, cautiously approaching Ethan. "Hey there, kiddo," he said gently, kneeling down to Ethan's level. "What do you have there?" Ethan looked up at the officer, his face lighting up with excitement. "It's a sword. I'm fighting dragons," he exclaimed, swinging it through the air with a joyful giggle. The officer chuckled, standing back up. He looked at Karen, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Ma'am, it's a toy. There's no need for concern." David couldn't help but feel a rush of relief, but Karen wasn't finished yet. "But what if," she started, but the officer cut her off. "There's no what if," he said, his voice firm. "This is not a weapon. It's a child's toy, and there's nothing criminal happening here." Karen's face reddened, but she said nothing more. The officers turned to leave, clearly having assessed the situation as harmless, but the tension in the air hadn't quite lifted. David watched them drive away, a mix of relief and anger coursing through him. Karen had crossed a line, one that no child should have to face. And as much as David wanted to put this behind him, he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. David stood with his arms crossed, trying to hold his frustration in check as Karen continued to argue her point. The officers, who had been silent for a few moments, finally began to examine the toy sword that had caused all this chaos. Ethan stood off to the side, his small hand still holding the plastic weapon, unaware of the tension swirling around him. His focus was entirely on his imaginary battle against dragons, completely innocent in his play. The taller officer took the sword from Ethan's hands, turning it over and inspecting it closely. He seemed to study it for a moment, running his fingers over the smooth plastic surface. The smaller officer, who had been quiet so far, glanced at the taller one, and then at Karen. There was a clear sense of disbelief in his eyes, though he maintained his professional demeanor. "Ma'am," the tall officer said, his voice calm but firm, "this is just a plastic toy. There's nothing dangerous here. It's harmless. We can't treat it like it's a real weapon." Karen's eyes flashed with irritation, her face flushed with frustration. "But you don't understand," she insisted. "What if someone had seen him and misinterpreted the situation? What if—" The officer interrupted her. "There was no threat, ma'am. The child is not a danger to anyone. This is just a toy, and he's simply playing. We deal with real threats, not imaginary ones." David, who had been holding back his own words, finally stepped forward. "Karen, I've told you this before. Ethan is just playing, and there's no reason to blow this out of proportion. You're creating a problem where there isn't one." Karen's gaze shifted between David and the officers, but she didn't back down. "I'm not making it up. I'm just trying to protect the neighborhood. People should be more careful, kids shouldn't be running around with things that look like weapons." The officers exchanged a brief glance. The smaller officer, looking more exasperated now, shook his head. "Ma'am, you're overreacting. I understand you're concerned, but you're not seeing the bigger picture. Children play with toys all the time. We can't arrest them for having a plastic sword. You're blowing this way out of proportion." Karen's face hardened. "I was just being responsible. Someone had to do something before this got out of hand." David took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. He had been calm so far, but Karen's insistence on pushing her perspective was grating. He could see how far her paranoia had gone, how she had twisted a harmless situation into something that felt threatening. She couldn't even admit when she was wrong. "This isn't about responsibility, Karen," David said evenly. "This is about your judgment. You saw a child with a toy and immediately assumed the worst. You called the police over a toy. Over nothing." Karen's jaw clenched. "I did the right thing. If you don't want to see it, that's your problem, not mine." The officers exchanged another glance, their patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am," the tall officer said, "you need to understand that not every situation can be treated like a threat. Children play with toys, and that's what he was doing. No harm was intended, and none was caused. It's time to let it go." David stepped in, his voice calm but resolute. "Karen, this is over. Ethan is not a threat. We've told you everything you need to know. There's no need to escalate things further." Karen stood frozen for a moment, the words hitting her harder than David intended. She had hoped this confrontation would end with her being justified, not with her being told she was wrong. But the truth was unavoidable now. The officers had seen the situation for what it was, a misunderstanding, one that had been blown out of proportion by fear. Karen finally turned away, her face red with frustration. She didn't look at Ethan, still quietly playing, still unaware of the storm that had passed through his life that afternoon. Instead, she gave a curt nod to the officers, then turned and walked back toward her house without another word. David watched her leave, feeling a small sense of triumph. He had defended his son, and the truth had come out. But even as Karen retreated, David couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. There was a part of him that knew she wouldn't just let it go, she would simmer with anger, and perhaps, in time, she would try to make life difficult for them again. Turning back to Ethan, David sighed in relief. The drama was finally over, but the strain of the day was still heavy on his shoulders. He walked over to Ethan, crouching down beside him. "Hey, buddy," David said, his voice soft. "You okay?" Ethan looked up at him with a big smile, holding the toy sword high above his head as if he had just won a great victory. "I beat all the dragons, Daddy. I'm a hero." David smiled, a real smile this time, and pulled Ethan into a hug. "You sure are, champ. You sure are." As the evening sky darkened, David held Ethan in his arms, letting the weight of the day wash away in the quiet comfort of their home. It had been a strange, stressful day, but in the end, it had reaffirmed something important. No matter what happened with Karen, David would always protect his son. And as long as they had each other, nothing else mattered. Ethan was safe, and the truth had come out. For now, that was enough. As the officers drove away, their sirens fading into the distance, the quiet of the neighborhood settled back in. David stood on the porch for a moment, his mind still processing the events of the afternoon. The tension from the confrontation lingered in the air, a sharp reminder of how quickly a simple situation had escalated. Karen, having muttered something under her breath, had retreated to her home with a bitter expression, no doubt still stewing over the fact that she had been wrong. David had expected her to be upset, but he hadn't expected the overwhelming sense of relief he felt in watching her walk away. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the events unfold in his mind. His son, Ethan, was still playing in the yard, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded around him. Ethan had been caught in the middle of an adult conflict, and David could feel his anger welling up again, the anger that Karen had dared to question his parenting, to paint his son as something he wasn't. But even as that anger surged, a more significant emotion swept over him: relief. Relief that Ethan had been safe, that the truth had come to light, and that the police had seen the situation for what it really was. David walked over to Ethan, who was now kneeling on the grass, holding the toy sword high in the air as if claiming victory. Ethan's face was lit up with joy, his eyes sparkling as he swung his sword around, pretending to be a hero in a world of make-believe. The innocence in his son's expression was enough to melt David's frustration, and he knelt down beside him. "Hey, buddy," David said softly, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You okay?" Ethan looked up at him, his face breaking into a wide grin. "I beat all the dragons, Daddy. I'm a hero." David's heart softened as he took a deep breath, fighting back the swell of emotion in his chest. He pulled Ethan into a hug, squeezing him tightly. "You sure are, champ. You sure are." As they stood together in the yard, David's thoughts wandered. He couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of the situation. How had something as innocent as a toy sword turned into such a battleground? How had his son's playful fantasy been twisted into something sinister in Karen's eyes? It was difficult to comprehend how quickly fear and suspicion could take root in someone's mind and poison what should have been a peaceful day. David knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced conflict with Karen. She hadn't just been mistaken, she had genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. In her mind, she was protecting the neighborhood, even if that meant imposing her own narrow view on others. But what disturbed David more was the realization that Karen might never truly see things differently. Even though she had been proven wrong today, her fear and suspicion were so deeply ingrained that he doubted this would be the end of it. David watched Ethan, who was now pretending the toy sword was a shield, fighting off invisible foes in his ever-expanding world of imagination. In that moment, David realized that the true battle wasn't against Karen, it was against the forces that would try to limit his son's innocence, his creativity, and his right to simply be a child. No one could take that away from him, not as long as David had a say. As the afternoon light began to fade, David stood up, holding Ethan's hand in his. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more people who would misunderstand, who would try to impose their views on him and his family. But for now, as he watched Ethan smile, as he listened to his son's laughter echoing through the yard, David knew that they were going to be okay. The road ahead might be long and uncertain, but one thing was clear: David would protect his son, and he would always stand by him, no matter what. They were stronger for having faced this together, and the truth had won out. David's eyes softened as he looked at Ethan one last time. "You're a good kid, Ethan. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." The sun had begun to set, casting a soft golden hue over the yard as David sat on the porch, his eyes following Ethan's every move. The laughter of his son filled the air, the sound a gentle reminder of the innocence he was so determined to protect. Ethan, still holding his toy sword, was lost in his world of imaginary dragons and heroes. To him, everything was simple, he was just playing, and the world was full of wonder. David's heart swelled with pride, but beneath the calm, a knot of worry tightened in his chest. Today's confrontation with Karen had been the first of many challenges he would likely face. He had won this battle, but David knew that the war was far from over. People like Karen didn't change easily. Her suspicion and fear would always find a way to re-emerge, and her need for control would continue to haunt their lives. But more than that, David had learned something crucial that afternoon: there would always be people who misunderstood, who feared what they didn't understand. As the evening light faded into dusk, David's thoughts drifted. He knew he couldn't protect Ethan from every misunderstanding, every person who might try to define him by their own fears. But what he could do was fight for the truth. He could stand up, not just for his family, but for everyone who had ever felt judged or misunderstood. He couldn't let Karen's actions, or anyone else's, diminish the joy and freedom that came with childhood. He had to be vigilant, not only for his son's sake but for the good of the whole community. David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his responsibility settle in. It wasn't just about one toy sword. It was about the right to live without fear, without being constantly watched or judged. It was about ensuring that his son, and every child, could grow up in a world that allowed them to dream, to play, to be themselves, without the shadow of unwarranted suspicion hanging over them. As he watched Ethan run around the yard, his small figure darting here and there, David made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let anyone define his family. He wouldn't let anyone limit his son's potential, his freedom, or his joy. He would stand tall, speak out, and take action when needed. No one would take that away from them, not while David still had the strength to protect them. The final thought that crossed his mind as he watched Ethan's laughter echo in the fading light was simple but resolute. I'll protect Ethan from all the fears in the world, even the ones that don't make sense. The camera lingered on David's face as he stood up and walked toward Ethan, the weight of his resolve settling into every step. As the screen began to fade to black, the message was clear: don't let fear and suspicion control your life. Stand up for what's right, protect what matters, and never back down.